The desert sun blazed mercilessly over the small frontier town of Copper Ridge as dust devils danced across the barren landscape. It was the summer of 1887, and tensions between settlers and the Apache tribes had reached a boiling point. The townspeople gathered in hushed groups, their faces etched with fear and anger as they whispered about the recent raids that had left several homesteads in ashes. Jake Morrison rode into town that scorching afternoon, his weathered face shadowed by the brim of his hat. He had been working cattle ranches across Arizona territory for 15 years, earning a reputation as an honest man who treated everyone fairly, regardless of their skin color or tribe. His horse's hooves kicked up small clouds of dust as he made his way toward the saloon, hoping for a cold drink and news from the surrounding area. The atmosphere in Copper Ridge felt different that day. Instead of the usual bustle of commerce and daily life, an ominous tension hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. Women hurried their children indoors, and men stood in tight circles, their hands resting on their gun belts as they spoke in low, urgent tones. As Jake dismounted and tied his horse to the hitching post, he overheard fragments of heated conversation from a group of townspeople gathered near the general store. Words like justice, revenge, and Apache floated through the air, sending an uncomfortable chill down his spine despite the oppressive heat. The saloon doors swung open with a creak as Jake entered, his spurs jangling softly against the wooden floor. The usual evening crowd had gathered early, their faces flushed with whiskey and righteous indignation. At a corner table sat Mayor Thomas Blackwood, a portly man with graying whiskers who had arrived in Copper Ridge only 2 years earlier with grand plans to civilize the territory. Beside the mayor sat Colonel Marcus Webb, a former military officer who now ran the largest cattle operation in the region. His steel-gray eyes held the cold determination of a man who had seen too much violence and had grown comfortable with dispensing it. The third man at their table was Sheriff Dale Curtis, a nervous individual who seemed more interested in pleasing the town's wealthy residents than upholding actual justice. Jake ordered his drink and found a seat at the bar, pretending to mind his own business while keeping his ears open. The conversation at the corner table grew louder as the alcohol flowed, and soon their words became clear enough for anyone to hear. "Those Apache devils struck the Henderson place last night," Mayor Blackwood declared, slamming his fist on the table, "burned it to the ground and made off with livestock worth 3 months' wages. Something has to be done, and it has to be done now." Colonel Webb nodded grimly, his scarred hands wrapped around a glass of whiskey. "I've been saying it for months. These sporadic raids will continue until we send a clear message that such behavior will not be tolerated. The territorial government is too far away to help us, so we must take matters into our own hands." Sheriff Curtis shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly out of his depth in the conversation, but afraid to voice any opposition. "What exactly are you proposing, gentlemen? We can't just ride out and start shooting people without proof of wrongdoing." The mayor's face reddened with anger. "Proof? The proof is in the ashes of 3 homesteads and the terror in our women's eyes. We know which band of Apache is responsible, and we know where they're camped. Colonel Webb's men captured 7 of their women yesterday while they were gathering water from Miller's Creek." Jake's hand tightened around his glass as he listened to the unfolding conversation. The capture of Apache women was a serious matter, one that could escalate the conflict beyond anything the small town could handle. He had lived among various tribes during his younger years and understood that such actions often led to devastating retaliation. "The women are being held in the old mining shed behind the church," Colonel Webb continued, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to making life-and-death decisions. "I propose we make an example of them. A public execution will demonstrate to their menfolk that we will not tolerate continued raids on our property and families." The sheriff's face went pale. "Colonel, I'm not sure that's legal. These women haven't been tried for any specific crime, and territorial law requires— Territorial law is 300 miles away, the mayor interrupted harshly. Out here, we make our own law. These Apache women are sisters, daughters, and wives of the warriors who have been terrorizing our community. Their execution will serve as both justice for past crimes and deterrence for future ones. Jake felt his stomach turn as the conversation continued. He had witnessed frontier justice before, and it rarely resembled actual justice. Too often, fear and prejudice guided such decisions, leading to tragedies that haunted communities for generations. The idea of executing 7 women without trial went against everything he believed about right and wrong. As the evening wore on, the 3 men continued planning their grim spectacle. They decided the execution would take place the following morning in the town square, with the entire population required to attend. Colonel Webb would provide the rope and oversee the construction of a makeshift gallows, while Mayor Blackwood would deliver a speech about frontier justice and community protection. The saloon gradually emptied as word of the planned execution spread through the town. Some residents seemed excited by the prospect of revenge, while others appeared troubled but unwilling to speak against the town's leadership. Jake remained at the bar long after the mayor and his companions had left, nursing his drink and wrestling with his conscience. That night, Jake couldn't sleep. He lay on his bedroll under the stars, staring up at the vast Arizona sky and thinking about the 7 Apache women locked in the mining shed. He had never met them, but he could imagine their terror as they faced the prospect of death without trial or hope of rescue. The more he thought about the situation, the more convinced he became that he had to act. Before dawn, Jake saddled his horse and rode quietly through the sleeping town toward the old mining shed. The building sat isolated behind the small wooden church, its windows boarded up and a single guard posted at the door. Jake recognized the guard as Billy Santos, a young ranch hand who worked for Colonel Webb and had a reputation for following orders without question. Jake approached slowly, his hands visible and his voice calm. "Morning, Billy. Heard there's been some excitement in town." Billy straightened up, trying to look more alert than he felt after spending the night on guard duty. "Mr. Morrison, yeah, we caught ourselves some Apache women yesterday. The colonel says they're going to pay for what their menfolk have been doing to the homesteads." "That's quite an undertaking," Jake replied carefully. "You sure the colonel has the authority to carry out executions? Seems like something that should go through proper legal channels." The young guard shrugged, clearly not interested in legal complexities. "The colonel knows what he's doing. These Apache have been nothing but trouble since I can remember. Maybe if we show them we mean business, they'll think twice before raiding our settlements." Jake nodded thoughtfully, studying the building and noting the heavy padlock on the door. "I suppose you're right. Well, I should get moving. Good luck with everything, Billy." As Jake rode back toward the center of town, his mind was already formulating a plan. He had only hours before the execution was scheduled to begin, and he would need help if he had any hope of preventing what he was certain would be a terrible injustice. The question was whether anyone in Copper Ridge would be willing to stand up to the mayor and Colonel Webb. The sun was just beginning to peek over the eastern mountains when Jake reached the hotel where he had rented a room. In a few hours, the town square would fill with people eager to witness what they believed would be righteous vengeance. 7 Apache women would face death without trial, without legal representation, and without hope unless someone found the courage to intervene. Jake checked his rifle and pistol, ensuring both were clean and loaded. He had no intention of starting a gunfight, but he knew that confronting powerful men often required the implicit threat of force. As a lone cowboy against the town's leadership, he would need every advantage he could muster. The morning air was already growing warm as Jake made his way to the general store, hoping to find allies among the more reasonable residents of Copper Ridge. He knew that not everyone supported the mayor's plan, but fear of social ostracism or economic retaliation kept most people silent in the face of injustice. As he walked down the main street, Jake could see preparations for the execution already beginning. Men were hauling lumber toward the town square, and the sound of hammering echoed between the buildings as a gallows began to take shape. The sight made his determination even stronger. In just a few hours, he would have to make a choice that could change his life forever, but he knew he couldn't stand by and watch innocent women die without at least trying to save them. Jake found his first ally in an unexpected place. Martha Sullivan, the widow who ran the town's boarding house, approached him as he stood watching the gallows construction. Her lined face showed the worry that many residents felt but were afraid to express openly. "Mr. Morrison," she said quietly, glancing around to ensure no one was watching their conversation. "I heard about what's planned for this morning. This isn't right. Those women haven't had a trial, haven't been allowed to speak for themselves. This isn't justice. It's revenge." Jake nodded, grateful to find someone who shared his concerns. "Mrs. Sullivan, I've been thinking the same thing, but speaking up against the mayor and Colonel Webb could be dangerous. They have most of the town convinced this is the right course of action." Martha's jaw tightened with determination. "Some things are more important than safety, Mr. Morrison. I've lived through enough frontier justice to know the difference between protecting a community and satisfying bloodlust. What's happening here today is wrong, and I'll not stand silent while innocent women are murdered." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Samuel Hayes, the town's physician. A thoughtful man in his 50s, Dr. Hayes had served as an army surgeon before settling in Copper Ridge to practice medicine among the civilian population. His medical oath had instilled in him a deep respect for human life that transcended racial and cultural boundaries. "I couldn't help but overhear," Dr. Hayes said, his voice heavy with concern. "I've been wrestling with this situation all night. As a medical professional, I've treated Apache, Mexican, and white patients with equal care. The idea of executing these women without trial goes against everything I believe about justice and human dignity." Jake felt a surge of hope as he realized he wasn't alone in his opposition to the planned execution. "Doctor, Mrs. Sullivan and I were just discussing the wrongness of this situation. The question is whether we can do anything to stop it." Dr. Hayes removed his spectacles and cleaned them nervously, a habit he had developed when facing difficult decisions. "I've been thinking about that all night. Colonel Webb has no legal authority to conduct executions. He's a private citizen now, not a military officer, and Mayor Blackwood's authority extends only to municipal matters. What they're planning is essentially vigilante murder." The sound of approaching footsteps made all three conspirators fall silent. Reverend Joseph Miller, the town's minister, approached with obvious distress written across his features. His normally neat appearance was disheveled, as if he had spent the night pacing and praying about the morning's events. "Forgive me for interrupting," Reverend Miller said, his voice strained with emotion. "I've been walking the streets since dawn, trying to find the courage to speak out against what's happening. As a man of God, I cannot stand silent while innocent blood is shed in the name of justice." Martha reached out and grasped the minister's arm reassuringly. "Reverend, we're all struggling with the same concerns. These women deserve better than what's planned for them." The minister's eyes filled with tears of frustration and moral anguish. "I've tried to speak with Mayor Blackwood and Colonel Webb, but they refuse to listen. They claim the Bible supports their actions, but they're twisting scripture to justify murder. The commandment is clear, 'Thou shalt not kill.'" Jake looked around at his unlikely band of allies and realized they represented the conscience of Copper Ridge. A cowboy, a widow, a doctor, and a minister. None of them possessed significant political power, but together they might be able to prevent a terrible injustice. "We need a plan," Jake said quietly. "The execution is set to begin in 2 hours. Colonel Webb has armed guards around the town square, and Sheriff Curtis won't oppose them. If we're going to act, we need to be smart about it." Dr. Hayes adjusted his spectacles and spoke with growing determination. I've been thinking about the legal aspects. Under territorial law, only a properly constituted court can order an execution. What Colonel Webb and Mayor Blackwood are planning is murder, pure and simple. If we can document their illegal actions, we might be able to seek justice through proper channels later. Martha shook her head grimly. Documentation won't help those women if they're already dead. We need to stop this from happening, not just record it for posterity. Reverend Miller straightened his shoulders, seeming to draw strength from his moral convictions. I believe we should make a public stand. If we speak out together during the proceedings, we might shame enough people into opposing this madness. Surely not everyone in town has lost their moral compass. Jake appreciated the minister's idealism, but his years on the frontier had taught him that public shaming rarely stopped determined men from violent actions. Reverend, I admire your faith in people's better nature, but Colonel Webb and his men aren't likely to be swayed by moral arguments. They're convinced they're doing the right thing. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of a commotion near the church. A group of Colonel Webb's ranch hands was bringing the 7 Apache women from the mining shed, their hands bound with rope as they were marched toward the town square. Even from a distance, Jake could see the dignity with which the women carried themselves despite their desperate circumstances. The oldest of the women appeared to be in her 50s, with graying hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to respect within her community. The youngest couldn't have been more than 16, her dark eyes wide with terror but her chin held high in defiance. Between them were 5 other women of various ages, all maintaining their composure despite facing imminent death. Look at them, Dr. Hayes whispered, his voice filled with admiration and sorrow. They're facing death with more courage than most of the men in this town show facing life. Jake studied the procession and noticed something that gave him an idea. The guards were treating their prisoners with casual indifference, clearly not expecting any rescue attempt. Moreover, the route from the church to the town square passed directly by the livery stable, where Jake had noticed several horses belonging to Colonel Webb's men. I have an idea, Jake said, his mind racing with possibilities. But it's risky, and I can't ask any of you to participate. If it goes wrong, we could all end up facing charges ourselves. Martha's eyes flashed with determination. Mr. Morrison, speaking for myself, I'd rather face charges for trying to save innocent lives than live with the guilt of doing nothing while they were murdered. Dr. Hayes nodded his agreement. I took an oath to preserve life. That oath didn't come with exceptions for race or nationality. Reverend Miller clasped his hands together, his face set with resolve. The Lord calls us to protect the innocent and defend the defenseless. I cannot claim to serve God while allowing this evil to proceed. Jake felt a surge of respect for his companions. None of them were warriors or gunfighters, but they were willing to risk everything for their principles. All right, then. Here's what I'm thinking. As Jake outlined his plan, the sound of the growing crowd in the town square provided an ominous backdrop. Word of the execution had spread to neighboring settlements, and people were arriving from miles around to witness what they expected to be a righteous spectacle. The atmosphere was festive, as if the town were preparing for a celebration rather than multiple murders. Colonel Webb had positioned his men strategically around the square, their rifles prominently displayed to discourage any potential interference. Mayor Blackwood stood on a makeshift platform, occasionally testing the crude microphone that had been set up to amplify his voice. The gallows loomed in the center of the square, its rough construction somehow making it appear even more sinister. Jake and his allies separated to take their positions, each understanding their role in the desperate plan they had devised. The margin for error was slim, and failure would likely result in their own arrest or worse. But the alternative, standing by while 7 innocent women were murdered, was unthinkable. As the Apache women were led into the town square, a hush fell over the crowd. Some spectators appeared excited by the prospect of witnessing frontier justice, while others seemed uncomfortable but unwilling to voice their objections. Children peered around their parents' legs, not fully understanding the gravity of what they were about to witness. The oldest Apache woman, who appeared to be the leader of the group, spoke quietly to her companions in their native language. Whatever she said seemed to give them strength. As their posture straightened and their expressions grew even more resolute, they would not give their executioners the satisfaction of seeing them beg or grovel. Mayor Blackwood stepped forward, raising his hand for attention. His voice boomed across the square as he began his prepared speech about frontier justice and community protection. The words rang hollow to Jake's ears, filled with self-righteous rhetoric designed to justify murder in the name of civilization. "Citizens of Copper Ridge," the mayor declared, his voice carrying easily across the silent square, "we gather here today to deliver justice for the crimes committed against our community by Apache raiders. These 7 women represent the support system that enables and encourages such attacks. Their execution will serve as a warning to others who would threaten our way of life." Jake positioned himself near the horses as planned, his hand resting casually on his pistol grip. Dr. Hayes had taken a position near the platform, ready to create a medical emergency if necessary. Martha stood among the crowd, prepared to begin shouting objections at the crucial moment, while Reverend Miller waited near the church, ready to ring the bell that would signal the beginning of their desperate rescue attempt. As the mayor's speech continued, Jake studied the faces in the crowd. Some showed bloodthirsty excitement, others revealed uncomfortable uncertainty, and a few displayed obvious distress at what was about to happen. He hoped that when the moment came, enough people would choose to do the right thing rather than simply follow the crowd. The nooses were placed around the necks of the 7 women, who continued to maintain their dignity even in the face of death. The youngest woman looked directly at Jake for a moment, and he saw not fear, but a quiet plea for justice in her dark eyes. In that moment, he knew that regardless of the consequences, he had to act. The moment of truth arrived as Mayor Blackwood raised his hand to signal the beginning of the execution. Just as he opened his mouth to give the final order, the church bell began tolling urgently. Reverend Miller pulled the rope with desperate determination, creating a sound that echoed across the town square like a warning of impending doom. The sudden clanging confused the crowd and caused Colonel Webb's men to look around uncertainly. In that moment of distraction, Dr. Hayes stepped forward and called out in a clear, authoritative voice that carried the weight of his medical training and moral conviction. "Stop. In the name of territorial law and human decency, I call upon this assembly to halt these illegal proceedings immediately." The doctor's unexpected intervention caused a murmur of surprise to ripple through the crowd. Mayor Blackwood's face reddened with anger as he realized his carefully orchestrated event was being disrupted by the very people he had expected to support him. "Dr. Hayes, you will sit down and remain silent," the mayor shouted. "This is not a medical matter. It's a question of frontier justice and community protection." But Dr. Hayes stood his ground, his voice growing stronger as he spoke. "This is not justice. It's murder. These women have not been tried by any legitimate court. They have not been allowed to present a defense or call witnesses. What you're planning violates every principle of law and human dignity." Martha Sullivan joined her voice to the doctor's protest, stepping forward from the crowd despite the risks to her own safety. "The doctor is right. This is wrong, and we all know it. We're better people than this, better than cold-blooded murder." The crowd began to stir uneasily as doubt crept into minds that had been convinced of the righteousness of their cause. Jake saw his opportunity and acted swiftly, drawing his pistol and firing 2 shots into the air. The sharp reports echoed across the square like thunder, causing horses to rear and people to duck for cover. "Everyone stay calm," Jake shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Nobody needs to get hurt here, but this execution stops now." Colonel Webb spun around, his hand moving toward his own weapon, but he froze when he found himself staring down the barrel of Jake's rifle. The cowboy had moved with surprising speed, positioning himself between the Apache women and their would-be executioners. "Morrison, you're making a terrible mistake," Colonel Webb warned, his voice tight with controlled anger. "These women are guilty of supporting raiders who have murdered innocent settlers. Justice demands their execution." Jake shook his head, never wavering in his aim. "Justice demands a fair trial, not a lynch mob. These women haven't been proven guilty of anything. All they've been proven guilty of is being Apache. And last I checked, that wasn't a capital crime." The standoff stretched taut as both sides evaluated their options. Colonel Webb's men had their rifles ready, but they were reluctant to start shooting with innocent townspeople in the line of fire. The Apache women stood silently, their dark eyes moving between their captors and their unexpected defender. Sheriff Curtis, who had been notably silent during the proceedings, finally found his voice. "Now hold on. Everyone just hold on. Maybe we should think about this a little more carefully. I mean, Mr. Morrison has a point about proper legal procedures." "Curtis, you spineless fool," Mayor Blackwood roared. "We discussed this. We agreed that frontier circumstances require frontier solutions. These Apache are enemies of civilization." But the sheriff's mild support for Jake's position had given other townspeople permission to voice their own doubts. Voices began calling out from different parts of the crowd, questioning the legality and morality of the planned execution. "Maybe we should send them to territorial authorities for trial. This doesn't feel right. We're not murderers. What if they're innocent? What if we're wrong?" The growing chorus of dissent clearly rattled Mayor Blackwood and Colonel Webb. Their carefully orchestrated event was falling apart as the community's conscience reasserted itself. Jake could see uncertainty creeping into the faces of even the most bloodthirsty supporters of the execution. Dr. Hayes pressed his advantage, addressing the crowd with the authority of an educated man. "Citizens, consider what we're about to do. If we execute these women without trial, how are we different from the raiders we claim to oppose? Do we really want to build our community on a foundation of murder and injustice?" The oldest Apache woman, who had remained silent throughout the ordeal, suddenly spoke in heavily accented but clear English. "We have done no wrong. We gathered water for our children. We harmed no one. We ask only for justice, not mercy." Her words carried such dignity and quiet strength that an uncomfortable silence fell over the crowd. Here was not a savage enemy, but a mother and grandmother asking only for fair treatment. The contrast between her nobility and the bloodthirsty mob seeking her death was stark and undeniable. Jake sensed the crowd's mood shifting decisively in their favor, but he knew Colonel Webb was too proud and too committed to back down easily. The standoff could still turn violent if not handled carefully. "Colonel," Jake said, his voice respectful but firm, "you're a man who served his country with honor. Is this really how you want to be remembered, as the man who murdered 7 unarmed women without trial?" For a moment, something flickered in Colonel Webb's eyes that might have been doubt or shame. But his pride and anger quickly reasserted themselves. "Morrison, you're interfering with justice. Stand aside or face the consequences." The tension in the square was palpable, as dozens of weapons remained trained on various targets. One wrong move could trigger a bloodbath that would haunt Copper Ridge for generations. Jake knew he had to find a way to defuse the situation before violence erupted. "I'll make you a deal, Colonel," Jake called out, his voice carrying clearly across the silent square. "Let these women go, and I'll personally escort them to territorial authorities for proper trial. If they're guilty of supporting raiders, let a real judge and jury decide their fate." Mayor Blackwood started to object, but Colonel Webb raised his hand for silence. The former military officer studied Jake's face, perhaps recognizing a fellow warrior's commitment to honor and principle. "And if I refuse?" Colonel Webb asked. Jake's answer was simple and direct. Then you'll have to go through me to get to them. And I promise you, Colonel, that won't happen without a fight." The crowd held its collective breath as the two men faced each other across 20 yards of dusty ground. Around them, lesser men waited to see which way the wind would blow, ready to follow whichever side emerged victorious. Reverend Miller's voice suddenly rose above the tension, reciting words that cut to the heart of the moral crisis facing the community. And Jesus said, "Let him who is without sin cast the first stone." Are we so perfect, so free from wrongdoing, that we can take these women's lives without trial or mercy? The minister's words struck home with several members of the crowd, adding another voice to the growing opposition to the execution. Jake could see the balance shifting further in favor of mercy and justice. Finally, Colonel Webb lowered his weapon, his shoulders sagging with the weight of conflicting emotions. "Very well, Morrison. Take them. But if any more raids occur, their blood will be on your hands." The release of tension was almost audible as weapons were lowered and the immediate threat of violence passed. Jake quickly moved to cut the ropes binding the Apache women, his hands trembling slightly with relief and residual adrenaline. As the bonds fell away, the oldest woman looked directly into Jake's eyes and spoke with quiet gratitude. "You are a man of honor. We will not forget this kindness." Dr. Hayes and Martha hurried forward to help tend to the women, who had been roughly handled during their captivity. Reverend Miller began organizing food and water for their journey to territorial authorities, while Sheriff Curtis reluctantly agreed to provide written documentation of the events. The crowd slowly dispersed, many people looking ashamed of their earlier bloodlust. The hastily constructed gallows stood empty, a grim reminder of how close the town had come to committing an atrocity in the name of justice. Jake spent the next hour making arrangements for the women's transport to territorial authorities in Tucson. True to his word, he would personally escort them to ensure they received fair treatment. Dr. Hayes volunteered to accompany them as a witness to the day's events. As they prepared to leave Copper Ridge, Jake reflected on the day's events. A potential massacre had been prevented, but the underlying tensions between settlers and Apache remained unresolved. Still, 7 innocent women were alive because a few people had found the courage to stand up for what was right. The Apache women maintained their dignity throughout the journey to Tucson, where territorial authorities conducted a proper investigation. No evidence was found linking any of them to the raids that had terrorized the settlers. They were released and returned to their families, but not before word spread throughout the territory about the cowboy who had risked his life to prevent their unjust execution. Years later, when relations between settlers and Apache had stabilized somewhat, the oldest of the 7 women would seek out Jake Morrison to thank him again for his courage. She would tell him that his actions had been remembered and honored by her people, and that his willingness to risk everything for justice had helped convince many Apache that not all white men were their enemies. The events at Copper Ridge became a legend throughout Arizona Territory, a story of how one man's courage and moral conviction had prevented a terrible injustice. Jake Morrison never sought fame or recognition for his actions, but he had demonstrated that even in the harsh frontier environment, principles of justice and human dignity could prevail when good people found the courage to stand up for what was right. The empty gallows in Copper Ridge was eventually dismantled, its wood used to build a schoolhouse where children of all backgrounds could learn together. It seemed a fitting end to the structure that had nearly claimed 7 innocent lives, transformed from an instrument of injustice into a symbol of hope and education for future generations.